Hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. My name's Warwick Powell. As we head towards the end of the 2025 Gregorian calendar year, it's probably a good time to take a little bit of a look back in the rear vision mirror and get a gauge on what's happened this year and also understand how that begins to shape the year coming up. Joining me to discuss this is none other than Einar Tangen. Many of you, I'm sure, have been wondering why Einar hasn't been on the show before, and I've always wanted to keep the best till last. Welcome to the show, Einar. Technology these days is really underpinned by algorithms. Algorithms decide who watches what and when they get to watch things. That's the reality of the world today. But with your help, we can also help nudge the algorithm a little bit for our channel. In a world where information is more usually disinformation and cutting through the clutter becomes increasingly difficult, sharing news that you trust and liking information that you trust is actually central to getting the message out. So, if I could ask you to help us with a like and a subscribe and a share, that would be much appreciated. Thanks very much.
Dr. Powell, it is truly an honor to be here with you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Look, Einar, incidentally, is a senior fellow at the Centre for Global Innovation, amongst many other things, and has been a renowned commentator and observer of global affairs from his home in Beijing over the last 20 odd years. Einar, perhaps you could just firstly give us a sense of what 2025 has been about. What have been the big picture dynamics, the major trends, and of course, some of the key events that have marked this year so far that continue to shape the nature of global development and international relationships?
Well, if you had asked me three questions, I would have said Trump, Trump, and Trump. Right now, everybody is reeling from the reality of his election. He promised that he would shake things up. He has. He has basically repeated the same pattern of behavior that we saw before, but on steroids. And before, I mean by Trump 1. So here's an individual who he has a lot of issues he wants to resolve. He thought he was disrespected. He thought he was persecuted. And we've seen that act out on the domestic stage. You literally, we are living in dog years. Every one day of Donald Trump is 7 days for the rest of us. His strategy is to throw out a few dead cats, which, if I throw out some huge lies and throw them on the table, everyone looks at them, of course. If I then release 20 little white bunnies into the room, everybody's eyes are going to go on those. And this is what we've had, a continuous stream of outrageous statements mixed with lies to basically keep the world upended. He's not shy about saying what how he does this. He believes in, quote, madman politics. He thinks that gives him an advantage. In real estate, you try to upset your opponents in the markets and then see what shakes out. And then you go in and you kind of grab whatever you think you can. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work very well for politics. In terms of overall, what he has done is he's created probably one of the greatest periods of uncertainty since the scares that were had in the 50s about nuclear war. People have economically and politically, they have no idea what the U.S. is up to. His recent defense policy statement has just roiled the world. And the reason I can say that with some authority is I was in Doha, the Doha Forum earlier this week, and across the board, whether they were ex-State Department ambassadors from the U.S., intellectuals, everybody is just scratching their head. How on earth can the largest player in the world decide that it is not going to abide by any rules? It is simply going to go forward and do whatever it is that it thinks is needed, basically going back to the rule of the jungle. Ironic, because it was the United States that said, to avoid a third world war, we will take an active stance in making sure that it doesn't happen, that we set up a system of rules and regulations, institutions that will prevent that from happening. Now it is the same country that is basically dissolving those. So if you start looking overall over this year, it has been about Trump, climate change, the fact that he's walked away from it, economic uncertainty because he's created these tariffs. And on the positive side, I would say that China has been the one bright light. It has been the only country other than Russia, but obviously a different situation, that has stood up to Donald Trump and done it successfully. Donald Trump, for some reason, wasn't aware that in 2008, the defense establishment through the Pentagon had written a white paper saying that if we get into any kind of situation with China, we will be cut off from rare earths. Rare earths are absolutely necessary to make defense equipment, also high tech cars, you name it. You go down the road, your robotic vacuum, etc. Mostly because not only are the elements used, but in various parts of the processing, but a critical part of that are these rare earth magnets, which are critical across the board. So you have a situation where he's roiled them, roiled the markets. People are trying to respond. China did. They made sure that he understood that he does not have all the cards. Going back to my previous point, in 2010, Japan and China had an issue. And that issue was over a territorial dispute in TIO, Senkaku Islands. And China, in essence, cut off rare earths going to Japan. It was eventually resolved. It has been a kind of a cold truce ever since then. But the fact is, America was very well aware of the fact that it was dependent on rare earths. And in fact, since that period, it's actually China's dominance has increased. So lo and behold, this year, Donald Trump suddenly wakes up to the fact that you can't make policy from your back pocket. You should know something about what is going on. He's surprised and then not exactly humiliated, but backed down. So, what we have is what I would call a juvenile approach to international politics, domestic politics, economics, where you have somebody who's saying, it's all their fault. They can be changed. Generally, it's immigrants or China or allies or neighbors, etc. It always comes down to this kind of whinging situation where America, this richest, most powerful country on earth, has been victimized by countries that are racked by civil war or hunger. It's hard to believe, but this is the reality that we face. So overall, as I said at the very beginning, Trump, Trump, Trump.
Speaking of this, it seems that there's a paradox, though, in 2025, and you touched on it, and I guess I wanted to drill in a little bit. As much as the administration in Washington has tried to upend many of the institutions that have underpinned global order, whether it's been economic order or political order over the course of the last 50, 60, and perhaps even 80 years, there has nonetheless been a resilience in all of this. And I wanted to drill into two aspects in particular. Firstly, in relation to the trading environment, the attack on global trade by way of the expansive tariffs that were introduced on the 2nd of April ultimately it seemed to have backfired. Global trade continued to grow. Trade amongst other nations separate to America seems to have continued to grow. And in fact, we saw the release of data that for the year to date, China's trade surplus has exceeded $1 trillion for the first time ever. So there seems to be a disconnect between policy and political ambition on the one hand and what's actually going on in reality on the other. And related to that, more broadly, is this question of global institutions. Attempts to undermine multilateral institutions seems to have catalyzed efforts by many countries around the world to work harder to consolidate the institutions that exist and not let the hard work of the past few decades go. Perhaps you could shed some perspective on both of those dimensions.
Okay, so I mean, Donald Trump, we've already discussed man-ban politics throughout tariffs. Tariffs are obviously attacks on your own people. For him, he thinks it's generating revenue, which he can then dispense, as he has just done with this $12 billion to farmers. Remember that in the past, he did exactly the same thing. Money was dispersed. Only 4% of the money actually went to farmers, individual small family farms. The rest of it went to big agriculture. Once again, you're seeing a situation, and it's probably going to be exactly the same, where big pharma gets a huge bailout while small farms go bankrupt. Now, getting back to this issue, you, from my understanding, is you said, okay, so he starts off with tariffs, and then you have a reaction. Yeah, the tariffs unfortunately didn't bring the world together. I mean, when you start attacking Canada, who is basically a captive nation, 99% of the energy they produce and export goes to the United States. The U.S. is, the overwhelming number one trade partner, and you're talking about a much smaller country that is entirely dependent. They did not do anything to the United States. Then you had Mexico. He turned on them. It's all about how the migrants coming from Mexico are drug dealers, rapists, and criminals, and things like this, who are sapping America's strength. Once again, going back to this victim narrative. Well, China's been able to push back, but it hasn't been without cost. Small businesses in China who relied on trade with the United States, that $800 exemption that you could send things from China to the United States, was done away with, and various other tax have done it. Now, the fact is that China is the largest manufacturer, and the U.S. cannot wean itself off on a partner where it is absolutely critical, whether you're talking about industries that rely on intermediate goods or consumers who are simply in a situation where they need new shoes or a backpack for their school kids. The UNDP came out about a month ago, I believe, an estimate that the United States will be about 11% of the world's manufacturing by 2030, while China's proportion will increase to 45%, giving you an idea that they do not believe that Trump's main idea that he's going to reindustrialize the U.S. is actually going to work. So not that it ever threatened in that direction. The amount of capital involved, the amount of time, and the fact that there's no appetite for a long-term investment, given what you said earlier about the overall situation globally and the uncertainty that I was referring to. So the second part of that is global resilience, what has happened. Although I'm personally disappointed that countries have not banded together more closely, you have seen the rise and interest in regional groups, whether it's trade situations like the RCEP, the trade group that the largest actually trade group now that encompasses 40% of the world's population, a good percentage of the trade, or things like BRICS, where countries are lining up to get in. The success and the expansion of SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is not a military organization, what it does is it talks about, well, we have existing countries. And the important thing to understand is that we cannot start separating them. Countries are an accident of history. In most cases, China being exception in terms of being a civilization state, one that has an identity, common language, etc. But the rest of the world, whether it was done by kings or drawn by colonialist countries, just kind of emerged. China believes strongly that if you're going to have a multipolar world that works, you cannot concentrate on what divides you. You have to concentrate on how you can keep the existing order in and work within it. So organizations like the SCO represent a completely different approach. It's not the UN, it's not NATO, it's not talking about how we're going to beat up some other country or the threats or everything. The threats are basically internal. So you have all these organizations out there that are expanding. Meanwhile, people have lost faith in the UN. They haven't abandoned it, but as it's constituted right now, the United States is able to, with impunity, thumb its nose at the rest of the world on issues like the genocide in Gaza, on global governance. It has still refused to allow the appointment of appellate judges at the World Trade Organization, meaning that there can never be any finality to any decision made at a lower level if one of the parties decides they want to appeal, meaning that it has been effectively hamstrung. So while on one hand you have the existing institutions, as we discussed, under attack, on the other hand you have a nascent rumblings of countries that are coming together because they feel that they really have no other choice. If I was going to offer a critique, and I did this at the Doha forum, which was just earlier this week, it is time for, after COP30, after, meeting after meeting where countries are being disappointed by the lack of planning and responsibleness, except perhaps with China, which has been the adult in the room. They have come to they should have come to the conclusion that these countries, developed countries, which now lag the world in terms of GDP, are not going to come to their aid, especially when it comes to issues of climate change and also development. It is time for these countries to come together by themselves and to start organizing around the particular strengths that they have. It should no longer be a resource curse. Why should something you need and I have be something that you can use against me? It doesn't make any kind of sense. These countries need to come together. I often use the example of coffee. 70% of the world's coffee is exported from 4 nations. Who controls the coffee industry? 4 companies that are based in Europe and the United States. When people right now are experiencing an increase in the cost of coffee, guess who is receiving the short end of the stick? Not the big corporations. What they're doing is they're putting increased pressure on farmers, saying that you should take a haircut. These are the people who get the least amount out of this. So it's time for these countries not only to band together and create a coffee bourse, all right, where they are setting the price of coffee, and at the same time concentrating on doing the downstream processing of it, where the real money is, and making sure that they can use industries like this to take care of their development needs, their social needs, and also their climate change necessities. And this can be used for chocolate, you name it, whether it's iron ore. It would fundamentally change the equation. You would see a evening out in the wealth transfer that happened under 600 years of colonialism, which is just basically rapacious plundering of other countries and then demeaning them on top of it with narratives that they were just a bunch of savages, when the reality was that they had civilizations that long predated anything that was very much organized in Europe or America. So, you have a situation where it's still in flux. We'll have to see next year whether these countries realize that if they do not use their economic power, the power of these large entities, especially the United States, will literally run them over.
It seems like that there's actually two conversations going on in the world at the moment. One that you've just touched upon, which is the conversations being led and driven by developing countries, the global south, broadly speaking, and another one which is a conversation of transatlantic victimhood. We've touched on the Trump perspective of the world, which is underpinned by the idea that America has been taken advantage of by everyone else. But perhaps we could just turn briefly to the situation in the European Union as well, because with the release of the recent trade data, which shows China's trade surplus, we've seen a re-emergence of fairly intensive hand-wringing about the what they would call the trade imbalances and the distortions that are now evident in the global trading landscape. And the Europeans seem to be at sixes and sevens on this particular set of issues. Where do you think Europe is fitting into all of this? And what do you think of the idea that there is still these two conversations that are, in a sense, taking place in the world, and which, of course, define the core contradiction, if you will, of our present age?
Core contradiction. Well, it goes back to what I was discussing earlier, is that you've had this 600 years of raping and pillaging countries by colonial powers. A lot of this was underpinned by first religion. We are bringing God to the unwashed masses and converting them, giving them a chance to go to heaven. Meanwhile, we're going to basically take all their money. To give you an example, India, what is known as India today, which was a bunch of independent small fiefdoms, countries ruled by sultans, etc. They were 24 to 27% of the world's GDP prior to the Great Britain showing up. After they left, India, is now constituted, was 4% of the world's GDP, in essence, impoverishing a group of people who now constitute the largest population in the world. This issue of crying victimhood, while basically saying that you're entitled to more, has hit the Europeans very hard. I mean, there's a racial element in this. The assumption was that only a white person could come up with new ideas. Only a white person should be allowed to dominate industries. You can recall that the car industry, especially in Germany, was globally dominant. They had a huge share. Where was the outcry that these were subsidized industries that were taking over and crushing local industries? They are preventing competitiveness and things like that. Well, the problem is today the shoe is on the other foot, and the Europeans are saying, gee, China, we're not competitive. Why? We can go into that. That's a long conversation about being undermined by the United States, who did not want to see Europe get together with Russian resources. The fact that the Europeans were our only peer competitor at the time, when we're going back to the fall of the wall, China has not risen. And there was this real concern that Russia and Europe would get together and be a peer competitor. The US doesn't do well with peer competitors. All you have to do is go back to Japan in the late 70s and mid 80s, which culminated in Japan signing the Plaza Accords. To put this in perspective, Japan has not been able to, in real dollar terms, get above where they were at that point. So today they're worth less in real dollar terms as a country than they did when they signed the Plaza Accords in 1985 and they came into effect in 86. So you have the victim narrative and you have the reality on the ground. The Europeans are somewhere in between. They seem paralyzed. On one hand, they see everything within this kind of focus of the Ukrainian war, a war which, from those outside, especially in the global South, first off, Europe did not see wars in, whether it's in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, as moral, um, you know, events where it was clear you were either on the right side of history or wrong. In fact, they participated in these particular wars in the Middle East, you name it, they were there supporting things. There were some aberrations with France, etc. But in general, they went along with the program. Now that the war is on their doorstep, they're screaming and crying that it is a moral issue that everyone has to be on their side with. Problem. Everyone looks at it and they say everybody knew if you went into Ukraine, if you broke the promises that America's Secretary of State Howard Baker made to the Duma and to individuals at the Kremlin as the Soviet Union was breaking up, that they would not move 1 inch, either NATO or the EU, into these buffer states that had comprised the Soviet bloc. Those promises were broken, but everybody knew that there were different lines. The brightest and red line was Ukraine. There wasn't, whether it was Kissinger or anybody, from the realpolitik crowd to those who even believed that, the spread of democracy was inevitable. They understood you go into Ukraine. It's not if the Russians will fight you. It's, definitely they will, and whether or not they're able to succeed. So that has happened. The Ukraine war has ruined the European economy by rejigging their energy status. They have been relying on cheap Russian gas that was piped in, about 1/3 of the cost of LNG. That disappeared, although they continue to buy it indirectly. It still costs more, and supply chains have been disrupted. Meanwhile, they rather than admit their sins, they're now doubling down and grabbing Russian money to be able to use in this kind of war effort, which makes no sense. The war in Ukraine is lost. You now hear daily gains by the Russians. And what are the Europeans doing? They're encouraging Zelensky to say, "Oh no, we're not in a position where we have to compromise. We're not going to give up any land. No territorial concessions." This is like somebody with a gun to your head saying, and you saying, "No, I'm not going to give you my money because I'm saving it for my old age." It's just not going to be there. And Europe is not in a position to help. If they were, in fact, to go into Russia, go into Ukraine with troops, it would threaten a global world war and potentially a nuclear catastrophe. So not a lot of joy going on. If you stand above this, as you correctly put it, you seem to have these kind of incoherent ideas that have come about. And unfortunately, going back to my first one, Trump, the Europeans have been trumped. They are in disarray. They need to develop markets. China obviously would be a huge one, but ASEAN as Asia as a whole is definitely a target, but they're hampered by their inability to see beyond the lens of a conflict, which they, in essence, were part of starting.
The situation in Europe, I guess, is, if not the defining theatre at the moment of some of these global macro tensions, is without doubt one of the major theatres. So if the core relationship driving many of the issues in the world is China and America, this conflict in Ukraine and in Europe seems to be where much of the issues are bubbling over. Now, we have Trump, who has this year made a big claim to being the peace president. And yet, so far, the conflict in Ukraine and other parts of the world actually continue to bubble away. That's the first point. But I guess my question to you, Einar, is uh, where does the difference in the end go between the rhetoric and the political performance, and ultimately the capacity of the EU as a functional economic and governance institution, together with NATO as a significantly depleted military power? Where does this all start to end up? Because it seems that the pressure is continuing to build on these post-war institutions in ways that they are now struggling to address, and certainly are struggling to hold things together.
Well, as your question implies, we're at a watershed. The institutions that served us post World War II have been put to the side. It doesn't mean they can't be resurrected. WTO could be, reformed. Certain issues. The UN, if it got rid of the Security Council vetoes, which makes it an autocratic power. Why should five nations, who by accident in history, and many of whom are no longer relevant, be deciding whether or not the rest of the world goes forward? And nowhere has that been more apparent than what's been happening in Gaza. The U.S. has, with impunity, voted again and again, basically the world versus two. Sometimes three or four, depending on who's getting some aid money from Donald Trump at the time. But basically saying to the world that we will not abide by laws, we will not abide by even the idea of the UN. We will simply act with impunity because we desire to do so. It is in our best interests. And this is where Europe is unable to push it to a point. They sit there, and when you ask their representatives, well, what about this? They go, tut tut, it's just Donald Trump. We can wait him out. America in the long term will come around. And I said, well, okay, what does that mean for Europe? Well, we're allies for things. I said, well, you're an axis of basically 15% of the world's people who have been able to take basically the majority of the money. You have the wealth, but how does this translate into actually creating value, being relevant to the world? Your wages are too high to do anything. Your energy costs are too high. To just do something in Europe takes 3 to 4 times longer than it does in China. Because of regulations, the slowness of how the government moves, it just is much more expensive. So how do you expect to be more nimble and able to answer the global economic challenges with such a system? And they say, well, we're Europe. We have, higher education. We have higher values. And this goes back to what I say is an underlying nascent racial discrimination, where it's basically we're white or mostly white. And therefore, since we've been pushing things around for 600 years, we expect to continue to do that. And this is the watershed, the moment when the rhetoric and the reality don't meet, and you have cognitive dissonance. The reality that you think is there is consistently being undermined by the reality that is actually rolling out. And this is where Europe is. They're trying desperately now to give you an example of just how nonsensical this is. They need to transform their energies from basically hydrocarbons as much as possible to renewables. China offers a cheap transition vehicles via solar and wind power to do that. And yet they're sitting there wringing their hands saying, well, but we're not profiting from this. well, where do they have the right to profit? I thought the profit came from innovation, ability to produce. This used to be something called competition. Now they're losing the competition. Competition is bad. So, but rather than taking this gift horse, they're examining the teeth and saying, we don't like it. It should be better for us. And they just can't seem to, when you confront them about this and say, look, you seem to be, you have an easy exit here. He says, yeah, but, we should be making money. I said, why? Why should you be making money? Well, it's only fair. I said, well, it wasn't fair when you dominated the world. Why is it fair now? He says, well, Einar, you really have to understand the global perspective here. And I say, well, it seems to be one of a colonial system, which is quickly evaporating. You say, oh, no, don't discount us. We still have plenty of things. We have the educational institutions and culture and all these things. And I said, yeah, but it's not getting the job done. The rest of the world is not going to wait for you to catch up. You didn't wait for anybody else. And now you have this kind of hypocritical insistence that everyone else should. So unfortunately, that trend is going to continue. The representatives that I ran into, European side in Doha, made it very clear that their tune has not changed. They're still whinging about the United States, but doing absolutely nothing to improve their situation.
You say, there is always the rest of the world, and so far we've spent a fair bit of the discussion today touching on issues that in large part directly relate to the Northern Hemisphere. Perhaps we could turn now to some of the dynamics in the Southern Hemisphere, and perhaps we can start again with Trump, Trump, Trump. And by that I mean the American turn to Central and Latin America. Obviously, there are conflicts or on the cusp of conflicts in Venezuela. There have been various pronouncements over the course of Trump 2.0 in relation to Panama Canal, et cetera, et cetera. What's going on in Latin America and Central America, and how does that intersect with these two conversations, if you will, in the world, which is the conversation of colonial powers holding on and the aspirations of the developing world to find an autonomous pathway forward?
Well, in short, politics, especially domestic ones, we're in a time of global downturn. So you're going to continue to see existing governments fall. Why? Not because of what they did or didn't do, in the most part. It's what they could not do, which is change the global situation. They cannot change the uncertainty that is being created by others. They cannot change the logistics situation, which is a hopscotch network where you're trying to figure out where you can import things that have lower tariffs, so you can export things to through other entities that have lower tariffs, making it more trade, more about a game than an actual competition. So they're they're stuck in this situation where they're exploring these different regional groups we were talking about, whether it's BRICS or Mercosur, African Union, you have the GCC coming together, the Arab League, you have SCO. There are basically regional entities, but they've been cowed. Anytime they put their head up and say, look, we have to take care of our country, as in Brazil. Donald Trump comes crashing down and says, 50% tariffs. And, if you start looking at the pattern, it's quite clear what he's doing. He's a bully. Bullies only fear bullies who will be bigger than them. And right now, he's put a 0 point on two areas. One is Russia and China. He wants to break them apart. I see this, this return to G2, which the United States rejected initially, is basically a way of trying to alienate Russia. I don't think China's buying into it. But the second part is, these groups, as they come together, they feel that they're cowed. The only way they can respond effectively is to explore these other groups, and it's very, 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 very slow. They're all pushed away. The only bright light that most of them see is China's successful resistance to this kind of terrible tariffs that Trump has instituted. They just said, look, we have something you need. You don't have the cards. We can, in essence, cripple a good part of your industrial complex, especially military, but also automotive and across the board. Unless you play ball, Trump, what does he do? He has no choice. He says, okay, but he's plotting and planning. He gets Japan to, basically roil the pot by claiming that they have some sort of interest in what happens in Taiwan, although they have signed 4 agreements and communiques starting in 1972, indicating that there's only one China. I wonder what the situation would be if China said, "Look, you conquered parts of your nation. We're going to basically back their independence, and we're saying that's a vital need to us." Japan would go completely nuts. But this is the hypocrisy that goes on. So, in terms of the global South, they're tentatively feeling out what they can do, but they need a hero, somebody who is able to stand up to the United States, but they don't want to get in the limelight. And you see that with BRICS. Going back to what I was alluding to earlier before I drifted, 50% on Brazil, 50% on India, 30% South Africa. Obviously, Russia is inundated with things and having their money taken. China, there was an attempt to, but it pushed back. What do they have in common? They are the BRICS. And this is what Donald Trump fears, is that he does not want a peer or larger group coming to Washington and simply saying, knock it off. I've said time and time again, the only way to respond to a bully is to gather together. Can you imagine if South America through Mercosur and EU, BRICS, or simply to tell Donald Trump, we have met, we're not forming an organization that is anti-American, but from now on, you're free to impose any tariffs you want on your own people, and that's between you and them. They will decide at the voting box whether or not that works for them. But you cannot pit the rest of us against each other for your benefit. It's a cynical colonial game, and we will not stand for it any longer. So do what you want to your own people, but if tariffs are imposed, they have to be global. And if you do not accept this, the rest of the world will start tariffing not only your exports, and remember, the United States is still the number 2 exporter in the world in terms of goods, but we also start tariffing your services. This is one of the only sweet spots in the American economy where they earn a substantial surplus from their trade and services. At that point, Donald Trump would do what he's most famous for, always chickening out. He'd realize the game is up. He cannot win. He would pivot. It's not ideological. He would make complaints and do this. He would take it and be vindictive to the extent he could. But if the world were to stand together, this would end this period of uncertainty. He could go back to terrorizing his domestic audiences with whatever kind of narrative he wants, but the global world would have stood up and said, "Look, we're not going along with this."
Look, I know you do a lot of programs right across the world, and I did want to pick your brains on what's going on in Africa as well as across Asia, but we're not going to have time for that today, which is a great excuse, of course, to get you back on to do some deep dives. What I did want to do was to wrap up this conversation by asking you to perhaps pull some of these threads together and give us a bit of an outlook for 2026, 2027. We're heading into midterm elections in the US. Clearly, the conflict in Europe continues to unfold. What are the things that people who care about these issues be keeping an eye out for? What are the lead indicators that may suggest particular shifts in global dynamics? Are there things that you expect to happen that perhaps others don't? So, crystal ball moment, Einar, as we head into the end of 2025.
If I had a crystal ball, I'd be pricing out small countries. No. Clearly, Donald Trump used to run elections, as did you. He's going to lose the midterms. The economic news is bad, and unfortunately, it's going to get worse. The Black Friday sales, if you start going through them with a fine-tooth comb, you'll find that people were actually, they don't have any credit card money. They don't have any cash. So what are they doing? Buy now, pay later, which means they're going to pay up to 30% more for the goods they couldn't afford today. They're not going to get more money tomorrow. The amount of money they're getting is not going up. So domestically within the United States, continue to see turmoil. He loses the elections. There's a real question as to whether, if he thinks he's going to lose, that he will declare martial law or start some sort of war where he insists that elections cannot be held simply because it's a state of emergency. Or if he perhaps waits and loses afterwards, that he does exactly the same thing. If he does that, you're going to see the United States in deep turmoil and perhaps social unrest. This, of course, affects the rest of the world. The U.S. is still the largest consumer of everything in terms of the world's outputs and things like this. So, yeah, you'd see a bleed-through effect. In terms of internationally, it's more of the same. The uncertainty continues. Nothing really changes. In terms of hopefulness, like I said, if you start seeing countries banding together to take advantage of the fact that they have resources that others need, especially in the United States and Europe, they'll be fine. Somebody asked me, I said, okay, what you're prescribing would be very difficult for China. I said, no, actually, it's a competitive advantage for China because it's able to produce at the lowest cost. So if your basic goods go up, what it does is it crowds out those who are not competitive. And that would be exacerbating this kind of headlong rush where Europe and America are becoming less competitive as opposed to more competitive. In terms of things that unexpected things, I said they're unexpected. If I was betting, I would say that the war in Ukraine does finally come to an end, but it does not come to end with a true peace agreement. Basically, Russia continues to take all of Donbass, and they draw a line around the territory that they have and that they've wanted, and that's where a kind of cold situation goes on, very much like North and South Korea did for those many, many years. Europe continues to deteriorate. You're going to see more social unrest. Unfortunately, that results in right-wing leaning parties taking more control, insisting that they don't want to participate in NATO. They do not want to participate in the war in Ukraine. Youth activism will increase because in places like Germany, where they're instituting the draft, they'll say, no, we don't want that. And you see a gradual economic deterioration continue in Europe. The unknown factor, both in the U.S. and in Europe, is whether a real leader appears. For too many years, you've had litmus test politics, and you see this playing out day after day in these scandals where the perpetrators were excused because if you don't follow the party line, all right, you're out. And therefore, you have to toe in. If we say that, here's the policy and you don't agree with it, well, if you make a ruckus, you're out. If you say, well, this guy's a bad guy, we need to do something, well, the party has decided he's not. So if you fight us on this, you're out. So what do you get? You don't get leaders. You get people who are used to acquiescing to whatever it is they're told they have to do. And this is exactly the problem throughout Europe. You have people who pretend that they have new ideas, but in actuality are just putting forward the same old repetition of stuff that hasn't worked in the past. So this is where we are today, unfortunately, and unfortunately it's going to continue the next 3 years as long as Donald Trump is there, and hope, ironically, that he stays there. Because if anything happens to Donald Trump, you have J.D. Vance, who I call Darth Vance. He is, dark enlightenment. I mean, this seems like some screenplay out of the next Star Wars movie. It's a group of people who do not believe that democracy and the rights of people to have some input on their future has worked, and therefore they're going to reestablish a nobility of the techno lords who will rule, benevolently for everybody. Sounds like, as I said, something out of Star Wars that is yet to come. So these are the trends. I wish I could say something very hopeful. I think China will continue to struggle. There has been a lot of economic costs. It's not like China has things in its hit small and medium-sized business entities. If there's something that is very bright on the future, I do believe that the digital tools now that allow you to advertise, deliver, and collect money, regardless of where you are in the world. And, the AI tools who can, tell you whether you're going to make a profit or not based on the existing regulations of that country. This could open up a new economic driver for the world, where small, medium-sized business entities are able to go out with specialized goods, develop their niches, and really turn the world around. Stop with these, large combines, 2 or 3 of them always seem to manage to dominate industries, and allow real competition to occur. To instead of producing a beer that kind of no one really likes but everyone can drink, you start having really good beers that can be produced even locally, but the recipe sent from somebody who really knows. Or the beer is actually sent there. But these specialized products catering to people who want something more than the humdrum, I think this is something that people should be looking out for, instead of these large entities which continue to slough off jobs while they can maintain their dominance of different industries.
Well, as they say, sometimes there are decades where nothing seems to happen, and then there are years or days where incredible amount of things get jam-packed in, and I think 2025 is one of those years. Uh, More things change, the more things stay the same. Einar Tangen, thank you very much for joining me for this 2025 wrap-up of the world, and hopefully those notes of optimism that you closed off shed some possibilities on where things could be as we enter 2026. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Spreading the news and getting the message out is really a community effort. I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment, or subscribe, in fact, to the channel. It would really help give the algorithm a nudge along. Thanks very much.